you were the first person, Clay, who flagged this to me about Phil Knight in Oregon. We got Amazing Drazan. Yep. Christine Drazan is now favored to win in Oregon. And the issue of crime is central, and specifically Portland and what's happened in the surrounding areas, Portland and its environs, central to this. Phil Knight has come out because crime is one of the big mobilizers and motivators in this midterm election. And Knight is saying that he will do, I'm trying to find the actual quote here, will do anything to defeat Democrat Tina Kotek. He's the co-founder of Nike. He is Oregon's richest man. He's worth billions and billions of dollars. And he is saying whatever checks he can write, he will write. I mean, Clay, it's been pretty straightforward. Portland went from a city, and like I said, I've only been there once, and it was over a decade ago. It used to be a cute, funky town with lots of bike trails where you could get some really good food, and the food trucks and all that stuff were operating. It was a cool place to visit. To it is now a giant open-air homeless shelter with 1,000 shootings a year and the highest overdose fatality rate it has ever had. This is it's happened very rapidly. We said this is what would happen with the Democrat policies they've pursued. And I think it is one of those places where crime and lawlessness and disorder are going to be just behind. I don't think immigration moves the needle in Portland. I think it does in Arizona. I think it does in Nevada. I think, in some of these close elections, it doesn't move the needle as much. Crime in Portland, or rather crime in Oregon, I think is the decider in this election as an issue, right behind the economy.
Yeah, look, and I think Phil Knight is interesting. I got a couple of quotes here. This is from the New York Times on Saturday. So we've had Christine Drazan. We had her on last week. We've had her on a couple of times. She is going to win. And I think that's starting to rattle a lot of people out there. And so here's a couple of quotes from Phil Knight that I thought were kind of interesting from the New York Times. Here's a quote from Phil Knight. One of the political cartoons after our legislative session had a person snorting cocaine out of a mountain of white. It said, "Which of these is illegal in Oregon?" And the answer was the plastic straw. Which is pretty funny to think about. But again, this was a political cartoon. This is a quote from Phil Knight in the New York Times. He also said that he is far more conservative than his Nike brand after they quizzed him on how he could support someone who is in Christine Drazan pro-life. And what I would say in general is I think Phil Knight's politics probably reflect much of the executive leadership, and certainly Phil Knight, from a business perspective, built an incredible company at Nike out of nothing. And Buck, his book, Shoe Dog, I think is the name of his book, is absolutely phenomenal. It's one of the best memoirs I have read of someone founding a company and being as transparent and honest as they could, telling the story of that company's founding. But here's the big challenge, I would say, in general, associated with that process. A lot of these guys aren't holding their companies to the same standards that they would embrace politically. And I'd love to get Phil Knight on this show sometime, Buck. I'm sure he wouldn't do it because he doesn't talk to media that often. But what I would ask him is just, okay, if you hate all of the politics that you are seeing in Oregon right now, why have you allowed your company, Nike, to embrace so many of these woke politics that you directly see destroying a state that you love in Oregon? Like, so many of these guys are willing to privately, I'm sure you see it too, Buck, a lot of executive CEOs. There's talk, Bob Chapek, who is the head of Disney, is actually a conservative, that he is a big Republican supporter. There are a lot of these guys out there, right, that run multi-billion-dollar companies, but they run their companies in the exact opposite way that their own personal politics would reflect. So my thing is just, why wouldn't you at least just keep it down the center of the road instead of embracing woke politics? Disney is a great example. Why not just say, look,
I think there's a couple of reasons.
Our goal is to entertain everybody. Like, we're not getting political at all.
I mean, we've been hoping for that, but that doesn't happen, and it doesn't happen because of two things. One is it's not a private company, right? So there's a board. Nike's a massive international conglomerate. You got a bunch of different board members. I don't even know if I assume he's probably still on the board. But there are these corporate, especially when you start adding into it like HR and diversity, and now all the way up to the board members. There are corporate centers of power within a company that will decide. That they're going to pursue wokeness in some way, and you'll have an internal fight because they're really committed to it, right? They're like the Bolsheviks of diversity and inclusion corporate policy.
Yeah.
It's their way or the highway. Like there's no that even for somebody who's a founder, if your company goes public, right, you can't necessarily just steamroll everybody. So I think that's one part of it. But the bigger part of it, and the one that we can certainly see and speak to, is for a long time the conservative mentality has been that we don't boycott, we're not crybabies, we don't do that. And we think, well, we're more adult and more real, we're better people than the left are, which is true, but on this issue and a lot of issues. But the issue then becomes you have one side pushing and the other side just walking away, or one side pushing and the other letting themselves get pushed around, because wokeness is so cohesive and because wokeness is such a mobilizer. When people don't do things to show Nike their displeasure with that, they become the only game in town. They become the only ones that are demanding politics without pushback. So I think you see that in a lot of companies, which is why the Disney phenomenon, I'm down here in Florida right now, the Disney phenomenon was such a wake-up call to corporate America, because now it's not just we're going to complain about it. Now it's there may be consequences.
Yeah.
So I do think that's a part of the Phil Knight phenomenon. But on the crime issue, more broadly, I mean, every company in America that was sending out all these, BLM, we stand with BLM, and we need to be having more, protests and defund police and all this stuff. When do they get held to account for this? Like, when are people going to say, hold on a second, why did corporate America mobilize behind a movement that has actually just been disastrous for everybody? So specifically for the people that was supposed to most help, the black community in America, BLM, when you look at the crime statistics, has been a disaster.
Well, and a lot of these people are followers, I think, is the other aspect of this. They're afraid of being behind whatever the current trend is. And that's what's disappointing to me. I mean, we got 100 millionaires, billionaires who listen to us. And what I would say to those guys and their families, the women out there as well, what are you afraid of? Like, worst case scenario, some people are going to disagree with your politics if you go public with it. Best case scenario, though, you're helping us to save the country. And I wonder on some level whether this is a function, frankly, Buck, of why a red wave is so important. In the same way that so many people got in line behind BLM and in the anti-Trump camp, and then they felt somehow justified based on the vote tallies that came out in 2020. I'm genuinely curious to see if we deliver this red wave, this red tsunami that I see building 22 days from now, will there be a market correction in some way where companies say, well, we're now going against the tides of American commerce? And what I would say in general is, and I'm writing a book about this right now and spending time thinking about it on a larger picture, but if you remember the accidental presidency of Jimmy Carter, it came about because of Watergate. I feel like Biden's presidency came about only because of COVID. And after Jimmy Carter, we had the Reagan Revolution, and things got back to normal pretty quickly in this country. And I tend to think that's what we are going to see starting in 2024, is that we swing rapidly sometimes in this country, and I think we swim so far left that most reasonable people in America are recognizing it. That's why I think we have a chance to win the governor's race in New York. That's why I think we have a chance to win the governor's race in Oregon. Nationwide, even in blue backgrounds, as you said in the first hour, Buck, there's a lot of panic. They got Biden campaigning in California and in Oregon 3 weeks before an election. That ain't a good sign for Republicans.
There was just over the weekend, and we were talking about Oregon, and it's because Phil Knight, when you have a high-profile billionaire who is saying that he will write whatever checks he has to because Oregon has been a Democrat one-party state since 1980, effectively.
Yes.
Right? So we're going on 40 years
That's
of
right.
Democrat rule there. They've ruined it. They've taken one of the most beautiful states that you can think of, and they've turned it into, at least in the city, I know people that live more eastern Oregon. Isn't there a part of Oregon that's looking to possibly join Idaho right now, by the way?
Yeah, they're trying to secede.
Yeah, that's what I mean. They're trying to join Idaho, right? That's a part of there's a movement there, too, which would make a lot of sense for those folks. But here we are. We're seeing that you can no longer, as a Democrat, you can no longer hide from the reality of what has been done to these places. I mean, I would just say over the weekend, even in New York City, my beloved New York, Clay, there were they broke into a jewelry store right on Fifth Avenue, right in Midtown. Guys going in there, I think they stole $500,000 of stuff, sledgehammers, very organized, very pre-planned situation, and they go into one of the most iconic areas, probably the most well-known to tourists in all of New York City. And they just smash and steal $500,000 worth of stuff, and it's all on video. They don't care, by the way. I mean, if they get caught, guess what? None of them are first-time offenders. All of them have criminal records. I'll just call my shot right now. They all have criminal records. They've all been arrested many times. None of them serve time for just having a marijuana cigarette. Like all these things we've heard about the criminal justice system have been a lie. And I think people have finally woken up. Do you want to be safe walking around the streets? Do you want to see endless homeless encampments on the streets, in front of businesses, in front of homes, people shooting up, people urinating and doing other bodily functions and things out in the street? Keep voting Democrat if you want those things. If you want that stuff to change, you have to do something else. This is nationwide. I think it is, we were being told a couple weeks ago crime was the second biggest issue. Now it looks like maybe it's immigration sliding in here, but after the economy. But it's certainly one of the biggest.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. But I do think you pointing out the Phil Knight, and we wrote about this at Outkick, and I've been paying a lot of attention to it. I just think what you will see is that many people in positions of power are followers. And as soon as we get this red tsunami, it will suddenly be acceptable to point out many of the Democrat Party's failures because the majority will be on that side. And what I would say is people out there who are super wealthy, I understand if you're making $60,000 a year and you're trying to put your kids through school and you're worried about losing your job. Trust me, I know there's a ton of you out there right now who pause every time you send a Facebook message, every time you send a tweet, and think, is this going to cost me my job? And you don't have the ability to take care of your family.
We've both been that person.
Yes.
We've both
been there.
40, 50 grand a year and been worried about saying the wrong thing and getting fired. So
I had two young kids worried about whether I could pay a mortgage, making $40,000 a year. So I understand that feeling. What I am speaking to here is we need more balls among the people who actually have the resources that nobody can touch them. What's the point of having FU money if you don't sometimes say FU, especially when those people are your enemies and are making this country an awful place? That's the question I'd like to ask the people out there with true FU money.